Dr. Hayley Pierce is an assistant professor in the sociology department here at BYU. Dr. Pierce received her bachelor's and master's degrees in sociology at Brigham Young University, and then went on to receive her master's and PhD in demography from the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Pierce's research focuses on many important women's studies issues, like maternal and child health and well-being, refugee health and well-being, the effects of adverse childhood experiences on fertility, and patterns of family, community, and policy interventions that influence health outcomes and health literacy. Outside of research, Dr. Pierce enjoys being outdoors, traveling with her husband and 2 sons, and baking cakes. Dr. Pierce's lecture is entitled Sexual Experience and Women's Empowerment in Africa, Role of Sexual Debut. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pierce.
So I got to give you some kind of context, and I'm doing something that I hate people do when they group Africa as this entity, right? It's so complicated, and it's made up of such diverse groups of women, but because we are trying to kind of paint a picture here, I'm just looking at a broad scope. And so keep that in mind, right? This is a context that is not as nuanced as it should be. But we have traditional societies which generally told women, girls, to get married young, because it would shorten the time between first menstruation and then marriage. And so you wanted that time to be short so that they wouldn't lose virginity before marriage. And so they wanted to save virginity, and so you wanted to shorten that time between menstruation and first intercourse or sexual debut. And so you wanted young girls to get married early. And there's research that says in the past 20 years, the age at first marriage is increasing in Africa throughout the country, throughout the continent, but there are countries that have variation. But overall, there have been kind of reductions in this early marriage phenomenon. They're not drastic, but there are reductions. And so this was a policy report about this kind of situation. It said premarital sex is the inevitable trade-off for all of the benefits of delayed marriage, right? If you're going to delay marriage, then premarital sex will just be kind of one aspect of that. And so there was this study that came out that was trying to look at that context. Is this the case, right? If we are going to increase age at first marriage, what's going to happen with the age at which people start their sexual debut? And so this study found that, yes, the prevalence of marriage before age 18 is declining in, I think there was 23 of the 27 countries that they particularly looked at. And then the prevalence of premarital sex at age 18 increased significantly. So yes, women were delaying marriage, but they were not delaying first sexual interaction. So this is kind of their conclusion, right? The prevalence of sexual initiation before age 18, whether they were married or not, neither increased nor decreased enough to signify a trend, right? So I'm going to show you, so the context changed. That was the thing, right? The age didn't change of when they were having their debut, but the context did, whether it was marriage or not, or whether it was welcomed or not, right? So the context is in flux, and that's about where this study ended. They were using data up until 2000. So I want to show you this age trend. So these are the countries that we are looking at in this study, and there are 32 of them. And this is the median age at first sexual intercourse for women. And you can see it's really static, right? It's stable throughout all of these years. And so we're increasing marriage, but we are not changing the age of sexual debut. So it's within this context that we wanted to understand, what does sexual debut mean for these women in terms of their future empowerment? So this is kind of, again, the context that we are studying within. So I've got to tell you a little bit about the sexual debut literature that is out there. And so it mostly comes from this framework of a really negative space, that it's really connected to adverse outcomes for women. So you can see here that these are just some of them. The first is the early initiation of sexual relationships, whether in marriage or not, is often associated with risky kind of transactional situations where you have younger girls engaging with older men for certain reasons, for security, for economic purposes, for, again, this kind of transactional nature of the whole process, which then in turn leads to uneven power dynamics within a couple. If you do have an often younger woman and an older man, you create different power dynamics. So less agency in the partnership, less agency in their sexual relationship, what kind of contraception you use, and the timing and duration and when, all of these things are generally left up to the man. And STI and pregnancy outcomes, there's a lot of research that's linking, again, early sexual debut to adverse outcomes. That's what's out there. All of this stemmed generally from the relationship to HIV and the epidemic that happened. And so we were trying to say, okay, what's happening with women who engage in early sex? And all of this came, again, because of the HIV epidemic. And I'll show you, this is generally the framework that this is studied in. You have some kind of situation of gender inequality, of societal circumstances that set a woman on a path towards early initiation of sexual debut. And you can see child sexual abuse, sexual coercion, rape, low status of women, all of these things were seemingly contributing to an earlier sexual debut. Then they were saying, okay, so what are the pathways then from that sexual debut to HIV kind of infection? And these were some of the options that they came up with. It increases your duration of exposure. It increases the likelihood that your partner is infected with HIV because they have more exposure and generally they are older. There's biological risks that you can encounter. So again, this is the framework of sexual debut. This is how we understand it. This is what is out there. It's under this context that it's generally bad. It's disempowering for women, right? It has all these adverse outcomes associated. So what then is my purpose for this project? And we were originally thinking that, again, sexual experience is an indicator and an outcome of empowerment. And we have to think of it in both of those regards, that it is a predictor and then an outcome. And we have to think of the context that's changing, because women are initiating their sexual debut in a different context than the generations before, where marriage is not as encouraged as early on, but the age of sexual debut is not changing. So we have to keep that in mind. And so we have to pay attention to these different facets of sexual experience that have been studied. But I want to go earlier, right? I want to shoot at the beginning of this experience. So what is the pathway then from initiation or sexual debut and then future empowerment that exists? And I'll make that connection here. So what kind of framework was driving this research? And we started with the life course, right? That's kind of just the broad framework that you can often rely on, this idea that there are sequences in life that don't happen in any particular order necessarily, but generally they do, and they have influence over time. But within life course theory, there's this concept of cumulative continuity, this idea that certain decisions, certain circumstances start to compound a little bit. So once you make one choice, it alters and accumulates over time to alter your trajectory. And so the existing literature would suggest that maybe the decisions that go into your sexual debut are also affecting your decision about education, your decision about how many children you have, your decision about your partner. And it's those decisions and their interrelatedness that would then alter your future empowerment. It is not actually the sexual debut, but it's this kind of compounding of circumstances that alter your empowerment. And so, let's go here. So where does this research fit? There's no really systematic look at any of this to look at the relationship of all of these things, because they're generally looked at independently. We look at, okay, what's one facet of sexual experience? or sexual debut, how does that alter empowerment? How does that alter power dynamics in a couple, an individual's health outcomes, their pregnancy outcomes? That literature exists. And then there's also literature that ties power and health and pregnancy to empowerment, right? So I'm trying to meld it all together to say that all of these things are really interrelated, and you can't quite parse out your sexual debut from your empowerment without thinking of all of the things that happen in the interim, right? And so what then is the research aim, or what was our goal here, was to just improve the understanding of this pathway from sexual debut, sexual initiation, to future empowerment. And in this data set, there are multiple ways to get at empowerment. For now, we are looking at the decisions they make within their household and then their justification of violence. And I will talk more about those in 1 second. But just to preface, we also looked at wantedness of their pregnancies and their use of contraception. And all of this falls in the same storyline. But I'll bring all of that back soon. So here's the data. We were using demographic and health survey data, which is about as good as it gets when you're looking at international sources. They survey over 90 countries, and we're looking at 32 within Africa. And we selected these because we were looking at women, and then they interview a subset of their spouses or their partners. And this was the most recent survey among these countries in Africa with this information. So you can see here the year of the survey, the sample size, and then the average age at sexual debut within these countries. And you can see it's a minimum of about 15 and a half and a maximum of about 19, with an average of 16.68. So there are issues with sexual debut recordings. We know it's often driven down by the women who have not initiated sex. It's complicated, but this is the best we have with this data, and generally is accepted in the literature with some complications or some caveats. So you can see the countries we have here, and again, this survey happens with women in reproductive age, so about 15 to 49, and they're asked questions about health and nutrition and their children and their marital kind of relationship. So again, it is for about 100,000 women in this sample. So I've got to go through a couple of the measures so you know what we're talking about here. So when I talk about sexual debut, the women are reporting the age when they had their first sexual intercourse. And so again, it's reported after the fact, and this for some women could be 20 some years later, but generally it's accepted that women remember this kind of experience and will report accordingly. Like I mentioned, when we're talking about empowerment, we have that measured here in two ways. The first is decision making. So they ask women who makes these certain decisions in their household about their own health care, large household purchases, visits to family or relatives, and then what to do with household earnings. And so women are asked if they participate in these decisions alone or in kind of tandem with their partner, or if the partner answers alone or somebody else. And so for each decision that the woman participates in, they increase in their score, right? So 0 is they make 0 decisions among these 4 decisions in their household. And a score of 4 is that they participate in all 4 of these decisions. Hopefully that makes sense. The next one is unjustified beating. And women are asked if it is justified for a woman, it doesn't even have to be them, if women hypothetically should or could be beaten, or if it's appropriate for them to be beaten if she goes out without telling her partner, neglects the children, argues with her partner, or refuses to have sex with her partner. So again, 0 means they justify violence in all 4 of these scenarios. And then a score of 4 means they do not justify violence in any of these circumstances. So the higher the score, the more empowered women are. And these measures are widely used in literature looking at kind of these international cases. So when I'm thinking about pathways, we went to the literature and looked at some of the main things that affect women's empowerment. And so we had to pair that with what was available in the data set across all of these countries. And we wanted to tell just a kind of simple story. We'll complicate it as we go on, but for now we're keeping it relatively simple. So these are some of the things that are known to influence women's decision-making powers and empowerment within their marital kind of or partnership. So the first is education, which is just a woman's report of how many years of educational attainment she has. From 0 is no education, then up to 22 years. Age at first birth is, again, her age at the first childbirth, whether the child survived or not. The number of children is the number of living children within her household, or I guess outside of her household as well. And then you have wealth, and then the older partner. So it's just the difference in the woman and her partner, whether it's married or cohabitating or whatever she reported. So I'm also controlling for the country they live in, whether they live in an urban or rural area, their current age, and then we also controlled for the age of male sexual debut. So this is their partner's sexual debut, but I thought it might kind of give us some understanding of what's happening with the men as well, if that age is changing. And that's a whole other storyline I'll have to get into another day. So we're using path analysis here. And again, we're trying to simplify this model So we're trying to kind of create this causal pathway while understanding that you can't determine causality, right? So a lot of these decisions are happening simultaneously. You are in your schooling, making decisions about your schooling when you're also making decisions about your first sexual debut. You're making all of these kind of things. And again, some of them are pathways, right? You have to have that initiation before you have a child. But this is generally what the literature says. So again, the bulk of the literature talks directly about this overall kind of relationship between age at sexual debut and then future empowerment. But we're saying that maybe that works through all of these different things, that these, again, are related decisions. And so you can see the plus and the minuses, which are generally what the literature suggests. It suggests that if you have an increase in sexual debut, you have an increase in education, an increase in the age at your first birth, and an increase in wealth, and then decreases in the number of children that you have over your life course, and then a decrease in the age discrepancy between your partner. And then you can see how different literature suggests that the higher education you have, the higher your empowerment, the higher your age at first birth, and the higher your wealth, the more you are empowered, right? So these are what the literature suggests that we will find. And again, this is controlling for all of these other types of things that we will not specifically mention here. So this is a lot of numbers, but it's just telling you who these women are in very basic descriptions. Within the empowerment measures, they're making an average of about 2.17 decisions within their household. So they're making about 2 decisions of the 4. And then they unjustify the violence in about 2 3/4 of the scenarios, right? Their mean educational attainment is very low, right? 4 years of education is because a very, very heavy proportion of this population has no education. And you can see the rest, about 32% live in an urban area. Their current age is about 30 years old. And the mean male age at sexual debut is just over 19, where it was just over 16 for women. So again, this is just kind of some broad descriptives. So what did we find? You can see in the top, the age of sexual debut pathway, just straight to decision making, is quite small, right? In 10 years, if you increase your age of sexual debut for 10 years, you can make maybe a quarter of a more decision in your household. So it's something, right? But it's not maybe so drastic like we've maybe thought it was. And you can see even then, about 2/3 of that effect is washed away or is taken away by the education path. And so it isn't merely this age at sexual debut. A lot of that is lost or is absorbed by just a change in your education. And you can see then about a quarter of that is your age at first birth, and then a 10th number of children, and then relatively small for wealth and an older partner. So the effects are quite minimal, and most of it is kind of explained through education. And this is decision making. I feel like there's rapid typing. I should be better at this as a teacher, right? Oh, I guess I should know. All of these are significant effects as well. They're small, but they are significant. They are not negligible, right? And then this is the justification of violence. So the direct effect or the overall effect of age at sexual debut on violence is still relatively small, though a little bit bigger than decision making. So for every 10 or so years, each increased year up to 10, I suppose, gives you about a third more unjustification of violence, right? Complicated to explain, but we wanted it to be more empowered the higher, right? So again, you've seen about half of that effect is explained through education, and pretty small on the other side, or for the other variables. So again, the overall kind of effect of sexual debut on these empowerment measures is relatively small, and a lot of it, at least half, can be explained through education. Like I mentioned, Africa is a whole entire continent full of millions of people that really need their own stories told, right? And so even this, just limiting it to one country, is not doing much justice. But I was looking a little bit at some of the nuance that exists between countries, and so I looked at the country with the most drastic spread in age at sexual debut between men and women, just to see what that was doing. So here, the sexual debut for women is about 15, and for men it's 23, and that's by far the biggest spread. And so you can see that the effect is bigger, right? For each year, they make almost a tenth more decisions in their household, and about half of that is explained through education. So this is just maybe to remind you that there's nuance here, right? That we're looking at 32 countries, and maybe telling a broad story isn't doing justice to some of these countries that do have a little bit stronger of a relationship. And then I looked at Kenya, who just had one of the stronger effects of unjustified violence. And so again, you can see that, and only 0.2% or 0.2 of that path is explained through education. So there is variation. Education seems to matter the most among all of the pathways, but it matters differently depending on the country that you're looking at. So what do we do with any of this, right? So the findings suggest that the overall effect of sexual debut on these empowerment measures is relatively small, and about half of that, plus some, can be explained by education. And overall, that's not quite the story that is being told currently. Definitely not the one that's been told in the past, and that's maybe speaking to different context. So looking at the studies that are relatively more current, I suspect that the relationship between sexual debut and empowerment is going through a different pathway. Maybe it's because they engage in more risky sexual behavior, but really I think it's just all of the other social pressures, right, that compound in a woman's lifetime from sexual debut to these empowerment within their partnerships that's altering empowerment, right? We like to patrol women's sexuality, right? And I think that research maybe has been one way that we do that. So that's maybe my biggest takeaway here, that we really need to rethink our understanding of sexuality and women and sexual debut, especially in the African context, but really overall, right? We are really uncomfortable with women and sexuality and them being in control of that. And then you add on African women and the stereotypes that we have, and we're not doing anyone justice, right? So is this a new way to think? I don't think so. I think a lot of people are on board with this. We know because women have sexual identities, right? And they're even outside of the sexual experiences that they have, they can be tied to a lot more things than that. So I don't think it's a new way to think, but maybe it is in some kind of research, because we know that sexual behavior is often shaped by the context in which we live, and so is the research. The research is shaped by the way that we know how to ask questions and the questions that we ask. So maybe we've been asking the wrong questions, considering the current context of sexuality in Africa. So again, the initial research has heavily focused on these negative adverse circumstances of women, that it's really, their sexual debut is driven by coercion, it's dangerous, it promotes HIV exposure, and maybe some of this is still at play, but maybe we could broaden our understanding, right? We don't want people to be in dangerous situations, but we don't want to limit it to dangerous situations. So age at sexual debut is on the decline around the world, and it's relatively static throughout Africa, like I showed. And so maybe the research needs to shift. And that's maybe the takeaway, right? We have to think, what is any of this showing? Is it showing that the coercion and danger is still at play? Or is it showing that maybe this is a form of empowerment that women can kind of tap into early on in their lives? Is it an indicator of more sexual freedom among adolescents? To some degree it is, right? Because age at marriage is increasing, but their sexual debut is not. And so they're making these decisions, we just don't quite know why. So where do we go? There is pathways research that suggests that women in really diverse contexts can take advantage of their sexual identity, that they consider their sexuality as a source of power and a mechanism to kind of alter their life courses in a positive way, right? The initial pathways suggest that the increasing age at sexual debut is the only method of empowerment or path to empowerment, and some pathways research suggests that you can embrace your sexuality, and that is a form of empowerment. So an overwhelmingly negative view on women's sexuality is disempowering in and of itself, right? So that's the limit, and if we start all of our questions in that context, in that framework, we are disempowering women without even their consent to do so. So it does not give women the opportunities to express their sexual identities in whatever way that may be. It could be sexual debut or in other facets. So maybe we could work towards a more positive view of sexuality and women. And again, that could be a global story, but also maybe in particular these women in Africa, where we have a really complicated relationship between sexuality and childbearing and women. Because often if we have this negative framework, we're just contributing to this narrative that women are really vulnerable, and they're vulnerable in sexual relationships, and that we need to protect them from male sexuality, which is often described as kind of coercive and beastly and out of control, right? And so if we perpetuate this through our research questions and through our research stories, maybe we're just confirming these narratives, confirming these stereotypes where maybe we don't need to, in a context that's potentially enlarging, right? So this was a quote: "Sexual rights empower people not only regarding their decisions in their sexual lives, but also by generating self-esteem, a new perception of citizenship, and control over their own lives in other spaces such as health, education, employment, etc." So your sexual identity is not siloed away from all of these other decisions that you make. And that, again, was the motivation for this pathway, that your sexual debut is really tied to all these other decisions you are making. And hopefully you are making them in an empowered state. If not, there can still be a lot of room for interventions and support. But it's asking the questions in a broader way without that agenda at the onset, because how will you open up to different findings if you're not willing to kind of understand this new context that is arising for women? So moving forward, where are we going to take this research, and maybe where could research go on this topic? First, we need to understand modern motivations for sexual debut. We maybe have some in the past, and maybe they were in those really coercive, adverse situations, but we need to ask these questions again to get the more modern understanding, the more modern take, especially in the context of raising age at marriage, right? And then we need to look for other explanations of women's empowerment, beyond sexual debut. And that can be including sexual debut, but that's just research overall, right? Continuing to figure out why women are disempowered in their communities, in their households, within their partner sphere, whatever that may be. And all of this comes back to that growing definition, that growing understanding of women and their sexuality and their sexual identities, because that is in and of itself empowering, right? Being able to take control of your sexuality is empowering, and we need to tell the stories as such, especially in the African context. So where are we going to take this research? Maybe take a look over time to see how these pathways function and shift as education initiatives expand, as this age in marriage expands. There's a lot of different things over time that we could try to tap into. And then literature in the U.S. suggests that father's presence in the home significantly alters a woman's sexual experience, especially sexual debut. So maybe that is something to look into in the African context, though the contexts are entirely different, but at least try to tap into how kind of family relationships might alter these motivations. And then one thing that I think might be interesting, at least in the US, there's menstruation data saying that it doesn't actually matter what age they initiate menstruation. It's just if they deviate too far from the averages. If they menstruate too early or too late, then that alters their outcomes. So maybe that's the case here as well, that it's not actually the age at sexual debut. It's just if you're way early or way late compared to the women around you. So we'll start to maybe look at that as well. There's a lot of work to be done. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Dr. Pierce, for sharing or giving us some of your time to further our education on women's studies. Your lecture, Sexual Experience and Women's Empowerment in Africa, the Role of Sexual Debut, gave us a fascinating look into the cultural opinions and ideas surrounding African women and their sexuality. Your background in education and sociology and demography were evident in this lecture and provided us with interesting facts and new ideas on how women experience life in places different than our own. Hopefully, after listening to Dr. Pierce, we can see how we have previously viewed and understood sexual experiences in Africa might not be accurate or fully complete. Usually, discussions about sexual experience in these regions revolve around the issue of HIV/AIDS and other types of health issues and stigmas that arise because of living conditions and lack of health services. However, with this lecture, we might see that the conversation about sexual experience in women in Africa can involve sexual debut and even empowerment. Dr. Pierce's research and focus lands on the future empowerment of women, specifically in regard to decision-making in households and ideas on the justification of violence. Sexual experience is decreasing all around the world, and in the Western world, a shift has been made to see it as a tool to empower, giving women strength in their sexuality. Dr. Pierce wanted to explore if that differed in Africa. Sexual debut does not have to be a bad thing, might not even have that large of an impact, and can even allow a woman to feel some freedom within herself and her sexuality. Sexual debut does not always have to mean one thing for young women in Africa. It does not have to dictate the beginning of a family, the end of an education, or the start of social exclusion. Sexuality is not one event. We have the opportunity to change the way we look at sexual experience. We can look at the broader story of the women we talk about. By viewing sexual debut as a pathway, we can alleviate previously established stereotypes. Sexual debut works through other experiences, events, factors, and relationships to influence an individual's empowerment. There are negative consequences that can emerge from a woman in Africa becoming sexually active. A woman engaging in sexual activities might have kids earlier than others, might have to drop out of school, might have different health issues, but it is not sexual debut itself that creates these outcomes. Lack of access to contraceptives and sexual education, cultural norms and beliefs, and ideas that sexual debut creates endings all affect an individual's life after sexual experience. If we change the narrative that sexual debut is only a disempowering and negative experience to an understanding that it can be empowering, exciting, and maybe less consequential, women in Africa, as well in other places, can find freedom and power in their bodies and experiences. Thank you again. We will now turn the time over to Eliza and Sophie for our question and answer session.
All right, thank you, Amelia, for that wonderful response, and thank you, Dr. Pierce. That was very, very amazing to listen to. Now we're going to have a question and answer session. Liza's going to start us off with the first question, and then anyone else who has questions can line up at the microphone.
All right. So you mentioned a lot about how it's important that we don't, through our questions, perpetuate the negative ideas of female sexuality. So how do you think that, how should we ask questions in order to not perpetuate that stereotype? And you can just come up here and answer.
First off, I want that, and that will be the conclusion to our paper. So send that to me. That sounds great. Makes my life easier. Co-author, too. Join it. So how... that's a good question, because it's something I grapple with every question that I ask as I come up with, right? We don't know how to ask questions that we aren't aware of asking, right? We have to have some kind of motivation for the question. And so it's all about maybe not creating that, not going into it with my agenda or my own kind of preconceived expectations, especially when I'm studying a group of people that I'm not there all the time. I don't live there. I don't know. And so it's hard to say one kind of foolproof way, because I think everyone that does research or asks questions about the things around them have some kind of bias, some kind of perspective, some kind of inkling, right, of what's going to happen. But it's all about just being open-minded and being ready to just kind of go where the data says, where these women say, and it's applied to just talk to people, right?